no provision for them. And it was in response to the Queen's, the non-denominational secular Queen's University, that the Catholic University of Ireland was set up. I think, as I say, Newman has been, I think, what his achievement then, in spite of the problems he had, and the degree thing in the end proved hopeless, and that was a very serious drawback for the university. As I say, he'd hoped the Queen's University of Ireland would validate the secular degrees, and that the degrees in theology could be validated by University of Rome, or possibly by Maynooth, or by the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. Now, the reference to Louvain is important here because what Newman did in Dublin was, or what he tried to do, was very original, because he tried to set up a university that would combine what he thought were the strengths of the English university system, that's to say the collegiate system and the tutorial system, but he wanted to combine that with the continental idea of university, where the professors were very strong and where research was considered important. He thought in his own day the colleges were too powerful. Today there's a slight difference, between Oxford and Cambridge. The university in Cambridge is more powerful, but in Oxford the colleges are still very powerful, and this leads to, of course, a lot of tensions between the university and the colleges. The colleges are making up the university, but ultimately there is a thing called the university, although as you probably know, American tourists often say, can you show us where the university campus is? To which the answer is, there is no campus. But what Newman wanted to do was to combine these two, and he made the professors very important in the Catholic University of Ireland. They were to govern the university, and not the heads of the collegiate houses that he set up, that were meant to correspond to the colleges in Oxford. Subsequently, after that, the failure of the Catholic University, he set up the Oratory School, which reference has been made this evening. The successor perhaps in Phillips, but the Oratory School, which he said fell under the objects to which I have especially given my time and thought. Again, the same theme coming up again, but fundamentally Newman saying, I'm an educator. Of course, he's a famous theologian. He wasn't famous as an educator at all, but that was what his heart was in, was educating, to which I have especially given my time and thought. Now here's something to think about. This gives one pause for thought, I think. Here's this extremely distinguished man, former leader of the Oxford movement, great theologian, very, very famous man. At the age of 63, he becomes a supply teacher, what we'd call a supply teacher at the Oratory School. And he writes, if I could believe it to be God's will, I would turn away my thoughts from ever writing anything, and I should see in the superintendence of these boys the nearest return to my Oxford life. Isn't that remarkable? School teaching. Newman didn't despise it. He is saying this is what, of course he had other important works still to write. Well, he hadn't yet, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua hadn't yet been published. His philosophical magnum opus, the Essay in Aid of Grammar of Assent, hadn't been published. So he had many important things still to write. But here he is saying, well, if I had my way, because he knew it wasn't really God's will for him, but if I had my way, he said, this is what I would do, is turn back to teaching. I wanted now, if I may just quote from my biography, to emphasize that theme again, and to go back now in time, to go back to 1840. He's still in Oxford and still an Anglican. He'd begun having doubts, serious doubts about the Anglican position in 1839. So 1840, the real crisis hasn't come, but he is in a state, he is very worried about the whole Tractarian position. And he goes out, it's Lent, and he goes out to Littlemore. Some of you may have been there. Now it's a sort of suburb of Oxford. It was then a village just outside the city, and was part of the parish of St Mary the Virgin. And Newman built the church there, which you can still see, because there was no church there. And he had the church built, and his mother actually opened it. Anyway, he goes out in Lent to stay in Littlemore, partly because his curate at the time, who was looking after Littlemore, had resigned his curacy and gone home to his father, who was seriously ill. But, and this is the point I wanted to emphasize to you, he was also very concerned about the state of the Littlemore school. Now we're talking about a kind of, I suppose it was sort of practically a kindergarten, kind of elementary school, and the people had been very young. And here's this great man, the leader of the Oxford movement, has already written some very weighty theological works, a famous preacher, and he goes out, and he's going there because he's worried about the school, this little village school, that's all it was, a little village school. He was not only, was the teacher lazy, he thought, but he was afraid that she drank. He arrived a little after, if I may read this from my biography, he arrived a little after 9 on Monday morning, 9th of March, 1840. The unfortunate schoolmistress, Mrs. Whitman, was still sweeping out the schoolroom, because it should have started, school should have started clearly. Only a few children had arrived and hardly any girls. Newman himself took the prayers, which should have begun at 9, and then called the roll. So this great man's calling the roll call, which did not take place normally till 10, but this morning was over by 20 to 10. Only just over half the children, nearly 100 who should have been present, were there. The boys were ill-behaved, the vicar noted disapprovingly, and most of the girls dirty, with uncombed hair. One little girl of about 5 was actually in ringlets. Didn't know why this was so shocking, but perhaps the ladies can reveal that to me. She was the schoolmistress's daughter, Mrs. Whitman's daughter. Well, although he could see the girl's hair wants combing, he could not go further in his analysis of the general air of slatterness which prevails, he solemnly informed his former pupil and former student and friend Henry Wilberforce. To his sister Jemima he boasted, "I have been reforming, or at least lecturing against uncombed hair and dirty faces and hands, but I find I am not deep in the philosophy of schoolgirl tidiness." Well, he spends the Lent up there a little more. He's mostly Lent up there a little more. And here we see him, these are little small children, and we see him, he practices the children in their singing, this famous man, accompanying them himself on the violin. He told his former curate Bloxham proudly at the end of March that in the preceding week he had already taught them 3 new tunes, and that he was even hoping to introduce them to Gregorian chant, rather daring, I would think. He was also thinking of having a practice in church on Sunday evenings to keep them out of idleness and mischief. He held catechism classes on Sunday afternoon, which he claimed to Jemima were holding their attention. So here's this great man, catechizing these little uneducated village children. He'd even won, he boasted, a victory in the field of female hygiene. "I have effected a great reform for the time in the girls' hands and faces, lectured with unblushing effrontery on the necessity of their keeping their work clean, and set them to knit stockings with all their might. Also, I'm going to give them some neat white pinafores for church use, and are going to contrive to make them. But other schoolgirl problems were less easy to solve, and in April he had to write to Bloxham for enlightenment about a strange request passed on to him by Mr. Whitman, the schoolmaster, the schoolmistress, from some young ladies to be allowed to have a ball in the schoolroom next week. "It does not look well, but they say you have hitherto allowed it." He hadn't done so much parochial work, he said with great satisfaction, since he had been a curate at St. Clement's Church, when he was still a deacon, and he had a record of visiting. He visited every single person in the parish, which was quite large. I've forgotten now the time, but it was really quite extraordinary. I think very few Catholic priests could boast of anything like that he was assiduous in visiting the houses of the parishioners. He was in fact enjoying himself, as he admitted to his Aunt Elizabeth. "I came out here as a sort of penance during Lent, but though without friends or books, I have as yet had nothing but pleasure, so that it seems a shame to spend Lent so happily." He felt so happy at Easter before leaving Littlemore that he quite dreaded some reverse. Now, isn't that astonishing? Here he is saying, it's pretty well saying, I haven't been so happy in years as being out here in this little village teaching these little school children. So I think that's rather remarkable. Very few people would know that about Newman. So what he did at the oratory school much later, with of course much older children, better educated children, was what he had really done in an ordinary, very simple rural village school back in 1840, when he was at the height of his powers, and he was one of the most famous people in the country, the leader of the Oxford movement, which was gradually transforming the Church of England. He was very pleased that he felt the oratory school had led the way in a system of educational improvement on a large scale through the Catholic community. A few years ago, a book was published by somebody called Nicholas Shrimpton, who teaches at Magdalen College School in Oxford, and it's really quite fascinating, giving the details of just how much time Newman spent in the school. Even as a cardinal, he would go in and he would always interview every single boy in the school. Of course, it wasn't a huge school. We're talking about, I suppose, at the height, probably about 80 boys. But it is remarkable that this famous venerable figure as a cardinal, he still went in, and this was still something that he cared very deeply about. I thought I would say something at home about it. What time am I supposed to stop? I don't know when we started. We started about 2:45.
Yes, about 7:30, because I'm sure there will be lots of questions.
Oh, not at 7:30, there was one start. Oh, I see, okay. Anyway, I'm coming in, I'm sort of in the middle. But I thought I'd say something a little bit about Newman's, because Newman's famous, of course, in the educational fields for his advocacy of liberal education. And I wanted to just say something about that because it's also to do with what he thought should happen in school as well as in university. And this has very often been misunderstood and often given lectures at American liberal arts colleges, where they're very proud that they're continuing Newman's idea of liberal education, but they very often don't understand what Newman's idea of liberal education actually was. What they think it is having a program of what they call in America great books. So you read you read a play or two of Shakespeare, and you read some Plato, and then you sort of take some classics from the Western canon. That's not what Newman meant by liberal education. That kind of education has definitely its value. It leads students, I suppose the word to use would be culture. Let's say they have a wide range of knowledge of some of the great works that have been written. But that's not what Newman meant by liberal education. What Newman meant by liberal education was the training of the mind, basically. And this is where Dwight Cullen, who I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, gets things very wrong. At the beginning of the discourses that Cullen had asked him to give, which formed the first half of the idea of university, he didn't actually deliver them all, but the first 5 he delivered. And then the second half of the idea of university consists of lectures and articles that he wrote for the university magazine. So there are 2 books really, and they were published to begin with as 2 books, and then he brought them together in 1873 under the title by which they're known, of course, now as the idea of a university. And this is what he says at the beginning of the discourses. This is what he's talking about. This is the aim, as he sees it, of university education. The intellect properly trained and formed